In 1714, England had a new king, a German, George I, the first of the Hanoverians. He came to a country where most people still grew their own food, but where in the great towns many people starved, surrounded by squalor and degradation. He came to a capital city where murder and violent robbery were common and were punished with unthinking brutality, where disease was usually incurable and the cure often killed. It was a time of war and a time of growth, when men and women laboured in the mines and forges and cottages for the goods that were making England rich. The upper classes became even wealthier, and a middle class emerged of merchants and tradespeople newly rich. They wanted to enter fashionable society with all possible speed, and were prepared to spend time and money to do so. Whether upper or middle class, they all lived in a tough and brutal age. They used their money to make for themselves, in the midst of poverty and dirt, their own comfortable, privileged world. A world that would last, no matter what changes might come, no matter how many criminals roamed the streets. So they set about it. They improved their estates, built new houses, or added bits to their old ones. Laid out parkland and planned gardens. They often came to London to sit in Parliament, to do business, to meet their friends. And they bought or leased townhouses where they could stay in comfort. These carefully proportioned squares and terraces seemed far away from the courts and alleys where the poor of London lived. The solidly built houses proclaimed to the world that their owners were men of wealth and taste, men to be reckoned with. Inside the houses, there was the same feeling of being in a predictable, well-ordered world. far removed from the dirt and noise of those distant streets.
We're now in a room lined with early 18th century panelling that came from a house in Chancery Lane. The panelling is very typical of its period, and so too is this chair, which I'm now going to show you in more detail. This chair has the generous proportions of most early 18th century furniture. It's rather like the people and the clothes that they wore. It's made of walnut, a wood rapidly going out of fashion to be replaced by mahogany. Its shape is based on curves. If we look at the curve of this leg, which is called a cabrio leg, we can see that the shape is emphasized by the carving. The carving is deep, and the motifs are leaves which are treated as pattern. We call this a stylized treatment. But the claw and ball foot is quite naturalistic. Let's have a look at the back. This central feature at the back is called the splat. It's mostly solid, but pierced in two places. It's also carved. Carving based on leaves and scrolls and on shells. This chair dates from about 1735 or 1740 and may have been made by Thomas Chippendale's father in Yorkshire, where the family came from.
The symmetry of architecture was repeated in the symmetry of the clothes the early Georgians wore. The line of the costume was the most important feature of the dress. Everyone conformed, and the fashionable all looked remarkably alike. The proportions and shape of clothes were to change very little over the years. Because shape was so important, they chose stiff, rich materials: damask, velvet, silk, and paduasoie, a silk from Padua in Italy. These fabrics held their folds well. Women were prepared to put up with quite a lot of discomfort as long as it was in the cause of fashion. First, they put on a linen shift. Knickers had not yet been invented. Then came an undercoat, the equivalent of our petticoat. Their bodies were then pulled into the fashionable shape with whalebone corsets. The whaling industry could hardly cope with the demand. Then came the petticoat, not just a piece of underwear, but an important and visible part of the whole outfit. But because they did not want to waste costly fabric or time, they stopped the trimming of the petticoat when it suddenly became one dress. The skirt of the gown was spread over whalebone hoops, and the 5 or 6 widths of material were gathered into a waist as tiny as whalebone stays would make it. The bodice too was tight-fitting, sometimes laced at the back, and it was finished with robings or revers. The costume was then completed with a stomacher, a stiffened triangular piece of fabric which covered the join of the bodice and skirt. The stomacher's straight upper border formed the base of the neckline, which was square and low. The sleeves were loose-fitting with turned-up cuffs. They were made to fit the armhole with gathers or small pleats. The natural shape of the bust entirely disappeared behind the tight, rigid stays.
No woman, in my opinion, can be entirely genteel who is not entirely flat in front.
One variation of style that ladies did adopt was the sack-back, which came in at about 1720. In this style, one piece of material hung freely from neck to hem in deep box pleats.
Men, too, stuck rigidly to a basic line for their clothes. Their breeches were rather baggy. There was no attempt to tailor them. The ample material was just gathered into a waistband and the legs buttoned at the knee. Their stockings were held up by garters. Over the breeches and the linen shirt went the waistcoat, which was in those days a long garment ending just above the knee. The silhouette of men's clothes followed women's. The waistcoats had to fit the waists tightly to be really fashionable. And sometimes laces were provided in the back to get them as slim-fitting as possible. The waistcoat flared out into a skirt and was stiffened with buckram to make sure that it did not droop untidily. The backs, which were never seen, were made of calico or linen, cheap fabrics. Even wealthy people took care not to spend money where it would be unappreciated. This anxiety to get the right shape at all costs meant that everyone looked more or less the same. Only the enormously fat or painfully thin were noticeable. With people of moderate shape, you couldn't tell which was whalebone or the human body.
Even the children were expected to conform and were dressed in miniature replicas of their parents' stiff, artificial-looking clothes. If you wanted to create an impression at a ball or evening party, you had to rely on vivid colours and rich decoration. This dress relies on its hand-painted design and pinked edges for its effect. Edgings and robings were often left with stamped-out raw edges and not hemmed as they would be today. But although these trimmings added novelty, the basic outline was not altered. This is brought out very well in a letter written by Mrs. Delaney in 1739, in which she describes a visit to a ball.
Lady Dysart was in a scarlet damask gown, facings and robings embroidered with gold and sundry colours. Her petticoat white satin, all covered with embroidery of the same sort, very fine and handsome. But her gaiety is all external, for she is the most wretched virtuous woman that I know. The gentle dash was in blue damask, the picture of modesty, and looked excessively pretty. The Duchess of Bedford's clothes were the most remarkably fine, though her finery was so common it was hardly distinguished. Her petticoat was of green paduasoy, embroidered very richly with silver and a few colours. The patterns was festoons of shells, coral, corn, cornflowers and seaweeds.
The rich silk fabrics, which before could only be imported from France, now were available in London. The French Huguenot weavers escaped religious persecution and came to England and set up a silk industry in Spitalfields. Flowered silks made on the broadloom were very expensive, perhaps 10 shillings a yard for a 21-inch wide lustring. The journeyman weaver earned about 12 shillings a week. And for this reason, silk dresses were often unpicked and remade. We often find evidence in original dresses of the carefulness and inventiveness of the seamstresses. Often underarms and other areas which would not be noticed are made up of small pieces of silk sewn together, rather like patchwork, to save the precious cloth. Children and adolescents were often dressed in cut-down clothes, made up of dresses cast off by their elders. Designers changed their patterns each year as fashion demanded. But as styles were so static, the designs of the fabric, rather than the cut of the dress, reflected the style of each year. The Spitalfield silk weavers, the stay makers, the dress and shirt makers could not, of course, afford to wear the clothes they made. Some were lucky The servants were given cast-off clothes by their masters or mistresses. But most people could not afford velvet at 26 shillings a yard, or satin shoes costing 16 shillings, even though they might earn 3 shillings a day if they were highly skilled. But the clothes of poor people, though they didn't have the elaborate embroidery and fine fabrics, echoed the lines and shapes of their richer countrymen. The rich, as always, could spend time and money not only on their clothes but on their persons as well. Their hairstyles had to balance the clothes they wore. Wide skirts would have looked very odd accompanied by simple short hair. So in their homes during the day, the ladies wore their hair long and loosely curled, usually covered with a pretty lace cap, and according to fashion they powdered their hair and used a greasy substance to stiffen it for the evening. So everyone at a ball not only had the same shape, but also the same colour hair.
Men wore wigs over their closely cropped heads. They were equally careful that their hairstyle balanced their elaborately stiffened coats.
Yet for all their magnificence, gentlemen did well to carry a sword in the folds of their velvet coats, for the door of their quiet and luxurious home opened onto a violent and noisy world.
And those splendid ladies, wearing silk right down to matching shoes, their elegance was often spoiled by the world they lived in. Those elegant shoes had to be placed into rather mundane patterns to protect them from the garbage and filth to be found on the pavements outside. Life was magnificent for the rich, but rather sordid for the poor.